What if I told you? The greatest spiritual event of the century didn't happen in Rome. It started in the dust of Arizona, and in the breathless silence of a Peruvian mountain dawn. Would you believe me? When that white smoke rose above the Vatican sky, the world expected another politician in robes, another safe choice, another man trained by power and perfected in silence. But what they got was Pope Leo XIV. They never expected him. Neither did I. But prophecy waits for no one. This man, born of two worlds, raised not in palaces, but in the wild spaces between America and Peru, where stories still live in the wind and truths are whispered between the stones. You see, while other cardinals were being groomed in gold chambers, he was listening to the sound of the condor crying across the Andes. He was walking barefoot among the ruins, reading scriptures, not from printed pages, but from the bones of the earth. This wasn't just an election, it was a rupture, a spiritual ambush. The Vatican didn't just select a pope, they ignited a prophecy. A voice rose from the New World, one that carried echoes older than Rome, older than Peter, older maybe than Eden itself. He came not with polished Latin, but with the raw language of rebellion, of healing, remembering, revealing, of dust and fire. And just like that, the seat of Peter was no longer just a throne of tradition. It became a portal to everything the church buried, to everything the empires of men forgot, to everything you were never supposed to see. But now you will. Because once the smoke cleared, we were left with a question that still shakes the marble halls of the Vatican. Who is Pope Leo XIV? A man? A prophet? Or the answer to a warning written across the stars? You feel it too, don't you? That stirring deep in your gut. That whisper that says there's more to this story. That maybe, just maybe, the truth didn't die. It just moved. To America. To Peru. To a voice the world wasn't ready for. So tell me, friend, are you ready? Are you ready to see what lies beneath the robes and rituals? Are you ready to follow the trail from the deserts of the West to the high places of the Andes, all the way to the gates of St. Peter's Basilica? Because what you're about to uncover isn't just a story, it's the reason the world went silent the moment Pope Leo XIV walked onto that balcony. Before we go deeper, do one thing for me. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you're not afraid of where the truth will take you. And drop a comment. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, because truth is global, and it's finally calling us home. They called it the most unpredictable conclave in modern history. And yet, before the smoke even cleared, the headline screamed across the world, Peruvian-American Cardinal elected Supreme Pontiff. Outsider Pope promises reform, rooted in forgotten doctrine. Who is Pope Leo XIV? Mystery deepens. On television screens from New York to Nairobi, anchors stammered. They didn't have pre-written scripts for this moment. The Vatican's inner circle stood stiff, blinking, silent. Some crossed themselves, others simply walked away. In St. Peter's Square, cheers turned into stunned whispers. Pilgrims cried, not out of joy, but something else, something ancient, something they couldn't name. He wasn't supposed to win. Not him. Not the desert preacher from the margins. Not the scholar who quoted apocryphal texts in seminary. Not the priest who once gave mass in Quechua, barefoot beneath a ruined sun temple. His name wasn't even on the list. And yet, he was chosen born to an American anthropologist and the daughter of a Peruvian priest who took a vow, then broke it for love. He carried within him two fires, the analytical mind of the West and the mystic memory of the Andes. He was a man made of opposites, earth and sky, dust and thunder, and somehow, that contradiction became Pope. The College of Cardinals, those robed guardians of a 1,000-year hierarchy, chose him. But why? Why would 78 men, sworn to tradition, break from centuries of quiet obedience? To crown an outsider? A man who challenged them in private, defied them in public, and refused to be shaped by their silence. Unless they knew something we didn't. Unless his name, his election, wasn't about politics at all, but about prophecy. Some say it began with a whisper in the Sistine Chapel, a single vote cast in faith and secrecy. Others claim the moment lightning struck the dome 2 days earlier, they knew. Rome was no longer in control. They say the vote shifted unnaturally fast, from the frontrunners to the ghost at the edge of the table. They say when his name was read aloud, the incense stopped burning, that a dove flew into the rafters and did not leave, that one cardinal fainted, another wept, and still, they voted, not because they agreed, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't. Some believed they were fulfilling a divine command. Others just wanted the burden off their shoulders. But it didn't matter. The ballots were sealed. The smoke was lit. And a name unknown to the masses, Elias Raphael Quispe O'Connell, rose from the ash of obscurity and became Pope Leo XIV. Not a king, not a compromise, but a sign. And the world? The world held its breath. Because deep down, we all knew this wasn't just a new pope. This was a turning point, a fracture, a reckoning. Something ancient had been set back into motion. And whether you were ready or not, it was already here. Before the white robes, before the ring, before the name Leo was even whispered in the Sistine Chapel. There was a boy who walked the dirt roads of Cusco with bare feet and a mind full of ancient riddles. A boy who didn't pray in stained glass cathedrals, but in caves where the wind sang through skull-shaped stones. They say he spoke 2 languages before he was 5, 3 by the time he was 7, and by 12. He could recite Enoch's forbidden verses from memory, verses most priests wouldn't dare mention aloud. He was born Elias Raphael Quispe O'Connell. His father, an American anthropologist obsessed with ancient timelines. His mother, the daughter of a disgraced priest who left the cloth but never left God. Together they raised him between relics and ruins, between Harvard lectures and mountain sacrifices. He read Aristotle by candlelight and translated lost dialects before he hit puberty. But it wasn't just knowledge he carried. It was something older, something unspoken. As a young man, he studied in Rome. He passed all the tests, but never fit into the mold. While others memorized encyclicals, he disappeared for weeks into the desert, while others bowed to hierarchy. He knelt at the graves of forgotten saints buried beneath Peruvian salt flats. He once refused to kiss a bishop's ring. When asked why, he said, "I only bow to the truth, not the men who fear it." They tried to silence him, tried to exile him. But the strange thing was, he never fought back. He just disappeared. And when he returned with stories, of scrolls found in dry riverbeds, of gospels without names, of a voice he heard echoing through Andean canyons. A voice that wasn't his, but knew his name. He preached not like a priest, but like a memory set on fire. People didn't just listen, they trembled. They say he healed a blind child outside Iquitos. They say his touch cooled a dying man's fever in New Mexico. They say he once stood silent for 9 hours at the edge of a cliff. And when he returned, he recited a prayer no one had ever heard before, in a language no scholar could recognize. Was it myth? Embellishment? Maybe. But here's what we do know. He declined promotions. He refused titles. He avoided the spotlight at every turn. And still, the people followed him. Not because of his charisma. He didn't have the polish of politicians. Not because of fame. He avoided cameras like shadows. But because when he spoke, something in you stirred. Something ancient. Something sleeping. They called him many names. El Profeta Blanco, the Condor of Cusco, the Man of the Divide. And in dusty churches across South America, they whispered of a time when one would rise, not from Rome, but from the mountains, not from lineage, but from the lineage of truth. A man not sent by the Church, but by the silence between its pages. This is who became Pope Leo XIV. Not a choice, a collision, not a campaign, a calling. The Vatican called him controversial. The cardinals called him dangerous. But the people, they called him necessary, because deep in the bones of forgotten civilizations, they remembered something we forgot. When the world begins to spin too fast, God doesn't raise up another king. He raises up a mirror. And in Pope Leo XIV, the world saw itself, not as it pretended to be, but as it truly was. Long before Rome crowned popes with rings of gold, long before Peter cast his shadow on the Vatican floor, there were whispers, not in Europe, but in the high places, the ancient places, in the cloud-wrapped temples of the Andes and the red dust chapels of the American Southwest. Prophets spoke of a time when a voice would rise from the union of the eagle and the condor, not myth, memory. For centuries the prophecy was dismissed, carved into stone in forgotten dialects, spoken around fires in the mountains of Peru, or tucked deep inside the journals of American missionaries who didn't understand what they had seen. But it was always there. The eagle, the condor, two great spirits, two continents, and a bridge, born of both. The eagle, soaring from the deserts of Arizona, carrying the mind, the fire, the rebellion of the West. The condor, gliding from the sacred Andes, carrying the memory, the mystery, the unbroken silence of the South. And the prophecy said, when the son of both shall walk the mountain and the throne, the age of forgetting shall end. The hidden church shall speak. The last light shall not come from Rome, but from the lands Rome tried to bury. They didn't know his name then, but now we do. Pope Leo XIV, a man born of two worlds, but tied to one destiny. And it didn't stop with Andean legends. Go further north, and you'll find echoes in Native American teachings. Go further east, and you'll find parallels in old Ethiopian scrolls. Even in the cryptic prophecy of Malachi, where each pope is named by a symbol, Leo XIV stands out like a skipped heartbeat. They say the last pope would be Peter the Roman. But what if we misunderstood? What if the last wasn't a return to the beginning, but a reversal of it? Not Peter from Rome, but Rome reborn through Peter's bones, in the new world. And now, as if on cue, the man with condor eyes and an eagle's voice sits on Peter's chair. He speaks of a church that predates the church. He speaks of truths older than dogma. He speaks in tongues, Latin, Quechua, Greek, and silence. But he doesn't speak to please. He speaks to awaken, and deep down, something in us remembers. We remember the stories told by ancestors who never wore robes. We remember the God who walked with the poor before he ever sat in a cathedral. We remember that light doesn't just descend from stained glass. Sometimes it rises from stone, from soil, from places the world forgets. And in this moment, as Rome bows beneath his feet and the Americas rise in his voice, we are faced with a question no bishop dares to ask aloud. Was Leo XIV elected by man or summoned by something much older? He hadn't been pope for 7 days before the tremors began. Not in the earth, but in the corridors of power. Cardinals grew pale, monasteries went quiet, and a hush fell over entire dioceses. Because Leo XIV didn't wait, he didn't bow, he didn't ask permission. He spoke. And when he did, the church flinched. In his very first address, he didn't speak from the apostolic palace. He stood barefoot in the Vatican gardens, holding an ancient staff said to have been carved from olive wood unearthed in the Andes. And he said, "We are not at the beginning of something new. We are at the awakening of what has always been." That single sentence sent shockwaves through every seminary in Europe. Then he opened the archives, not the ones they show to tourists, the ones buried behind vault doors, sealed by blood, oath, and fear. He gave scholars access to texts long condemned as heresy: the Book of Enoch, the Gospel of Thomas, the hidden scrolls of Nag Hammadi, and a mysterious codex referred to only as Codex Quispe 7, found decades earlier in a Peruvian tomb, translated in silence, and locked away. He didn't just acknowledge their existence, he declared them essential, and in doing so, he set the church on fire. His critics called him reckless, dangerous, a destabilizer, but he didn't flinch. He declared that the Ark of the Covenant, the very throne of divine presence, may not rest in Jerusalem or Rome, but in a hidden valley deep in the sacred Andes, where stars align only once every 7,000 years. He claimed the fall of man in Genesis was not a historical event, but a cosmic metaphor, a veil drawn over an earlier age of humanity, now rising again. He said, Eden was not the start of humanity, but the first attempt to remember it. And then came the American revelations. Leo XIV began referencing texts only known to high-level intelligence circles, government files on anomalous ruins in New Mexico, native oral histories that spoke of sky beings, watchers, and the coming of a white priest from the east who speaks the language of trees. It wasn't just theology anymore. It was geopolitics. It was forbidden archaeology. It was a war for the timeline of truth itself. The CIA, they say, had monitored him for years, not because he was a threat to nations, but because he was unlocking a narrative older than nations. A truth buried not only by the church, but by governments, empires, and empires before them. He spoke of pre-Adamic civilizations. He referenced the Nephilim as not myth, but blurred memory. He called the ancient megaliths of Peru sermons carved in stone, and the Vatican trembled. One bishop whispered, "If he's right, every homily we've ever preached is half a gospel." And still, he kept going. He didn't ask the world to believe him. He asked them to remember the voices silenced by the sword, the wisdom labeled pagan, the chants turned into ashes, the gods renamed, the truths renamed, until only one story remained. But he reopened the door, and once it opened, it could not be closed. Because he wasn't just digging through doctrine, he was digging through us, our collective amnesia, our fear of remembering, our fear of a God who doesn't fit in stained glass. And slowly, the people began to listen, in cathedrals, in mountain villages, in trailer parks and tea shops and temples around the world. They leaned in, not to the robe, but to the voice that said, "The truth isn't lost. It was hidden, and you have the key." They thought Rome was the center. They thought all light flowed from its marble veins. That truth could only echo through basilicas built by empire. That holiness wore red shoes and carried golden staffs. But Pope Leo XIV, he turned everything upside down, not with rebellion, but with return. He said, "We do not need to invent a new church. We need to remember the one the world buried." And with that, he began moving the center of gravity, from the polished corridors of the Vatican to the stone steps of Machu Picchu, from the throne of Peter to the altar of the Andes, from America to Peru. He started his first pilgrimage not in Rome, but across the sacred valley, walking, on foot, no entourage, no camera, no throne, just a staff and silence. They called it madness, but the people called it something else, a reset. Everywhere he went, he brought opposites together, bishops and tribal elders, nuns and shamans, atheists and monks. He didn't lecture, he listened. In the Amazon, he sat with uncontacted tribes and asked for forgiveness, not as a pope, but as a man wearing the robe of those who once brought fire and chains. In New Mexico, he stood beneath the red cliffs and spoke the names of indigenous children erased from the church's schools. He didn't just preach reconciliation, he became it, and something shifted. The old world watched in confusion, but the forgotten world, the silenced world, it began to stir. People who hadn't prayed in decades began lighting candles again, not to saints sculpted in Europe, but to the unnamed ones their ancestors whispered to in caves. People didn't just believe again, they remembered. He gave Mass in the middle of a jungle clearing, using bread made from maize and wine fermented by the hands of native farmers. And he said, "This is the body. This is the blood." Not because Rome approved it, but because heaven never denied it. He didn't destroy the church. He made it breathe again. He gave back the sacred to those told they never had it. He cracked open the tabernacle and let the wind rush in. He spoke of a global spiritual reset, where no tongue was superior, no land more holy, no race more chosen. He taught that the next council should not be held under Michelangelo's ceiling, but under open skies, in the mountains, among the ruins, where the silence of the earth still remembers the name of God. The media couldn't make sense of it. They tried to box him in, progressive, radical, heretic. But the people, they knew. He wasn't pushing a new doctrine, he was unearthing an old one buried beneath centuries of conquest, comfort, and control. From the deserts of Arizona to the ruins of Sacsayhuaman, from cornfields in Iowa to cathedrals in Cusco, people knelt, not because they were told to, but because they finally felt something real. They felt seen, they felt heard, they felt like the gospel had come home. And Rome? Rome felt the weight of history turning in its bed, because Pope Leo XIV wasn't trying to save the church as it was. He was trying to resurrect the church that could be, not Roman, not European, not Western, but human, whole, and finally, awake. The world didn't end when Pope Leo XIV stepped onto the balcony, but something did. A silence, a lie, a comfort we had mistaken for truth, and in its place, a sound returned, faint at first, but unmistakable, the sound of memory, of soil singing, of voices once buried beneath marble and conquest, now rising like incense into the open sky. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't seek approval. He simply said, "The throne of Peter was never meant to control. It was meant to remind, and we have forgotten." And in that one sentence, he did what centuries of tradition could not. He made us look inward, not at stained glass saints, but at the temple behind our own ribs, not at the golden tabernacles locked behind velvet ropes, but at the fire flickering beneath our own breath. He didn't preach fear. He didn't promise heaven for a price. He offered something rarer, honesty. He said, "You were told what to believe, but not how to listen. The truth isn't something you inherit. It's something you uncover." And then, he did the unthinkable. He stepped back. He withdrew from pomp, from press, from spectacle. He returned to the mountains. Some say he's writing. Some say he's praying. Some say he's waiting. But for what? Maybe for us. For us to catch up, to question, to remember, to dig deeper, to stand not on tradition, but on truth. Because now it's not about him. It's about you. It's about whether you'll keep hiding behind what's comfortable or step into what's real. Will you bow to fear or rise with memory? Will you cling to a church of marble or become the church that breathes? Because Pope Leo XIV may be a man or a moment, a mirror or a messenger. But one thing is certain: he has changed the world, and once truth speaks, it cannot be unsaid. So now I ask you, not as a viewer, not as a follower, but as a seeker, are you ready to remember? The truth was never lost. It was waiting. And now, it's calling your name. If you've heard something today that stirred you, like a memory you forgot you had, hit the like button, subscribe to Pope Leo XIV Truth, and comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Because truth isn't European, it isn't American, it's global, it's eternal, and it just woke up. Truth isn't popular, but it is eternal.